welcome to the Aquatic Restoration and Global Biodiversity Framework webinar, co-organized by FAO and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I've been very much looking forward to this event since it was first imagined, and I really want to thank all of you for joining, especially our panelists. The tremendous turnout really speaks to the deep importance of aquatic ecosystems. They underlie our sustainable future. And I think it also speaks to a very strong global sense of collaboration that exists across all of us working on aquatic ecosystems. So we have an impressive and also a very fun group of presenter panelists today from across the world. We are a very small team. We've been working together. We have the shared mission, and we've agreed to cut each other off at 10 minutes sharp. So it's really, we're working together to make sure we save time for a lively discussion with all of you. A few housekeeping things before we begin. Your audio is muted by default, so please written participation will work best. Please introduce yourself in the chat and make any comments, raise any issues that come to mind in the chat. As we come towards the Q&A portion of the presentation, please enter your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. If you have a very specific panelist in mind, just note it and we'll try to ask all of your questions. The more questions, the better. So we can really begin to answer the question, how do we ensure that aquatic ecosystems and their restoration are prioritized in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework? So I turn the webinar over to Julian Fox, Team Leader, National Forest Monitoring Team, Forestry Division, FAO, and also lead of the Task Force on Monitoring for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, to set the stage. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's really great to be here on this important webinar. So yeah, basically, I think I remember last November we had a really important global meeting in Rome. It was co-organized between FAO, UN Decade, and CBD, and we were developing a roadmap. And I'll talk about Target 2 in a moment. And we had a specific breakout group that were looking at the aquatic side, and we realized, wow, there's a lot of unanswered questions here. And actually, many of the people here, Ashley, Kim, your facilitators, were in that discussion group, and I think that's why we're here, because there's a lot of unanswered questions around restoration and aquatic ecosystems, and also how we measure progress of that restoration effort. So, I mean, this comes at a perfect moment. Next week is Substa in Kenya of the CBD, and the discussions will continue. I'll put in the chat a link to another side event that you may be interested in joining. And there's another specific side event also on aquatics in Kenya. So next slide, please. So when the UN Decade started in 2021, it seems like an age ago, but it was only 3 or 4 years ago, the immediate question that the UN Decade wanted to understand was, what is the global status of ecosystem restoration? How much restoration is going on out there? You know, we've seen some incredible commitments, actually mainly on the terrestrial side, I have to say. This famous 1 billion hectares of restoration commitments from countries. But yeah, we really don't know how much of that has started, how much is ongoing, and where we are in terms of those government commitments. We have a patchwork of different platforms, of frameworks, often for different ecosystems. And under the UN Decade, we really wanted to try and harmonize this, build on what was existing already. And then at the end of 2021, the governments of the world agreed on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a really landmark effort. And we tried to bring everything together. And if we go to the next slide, so yeah, we created this really exciting task force for monitoring. I was asked to lead it, and I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into. But anyway, it was all hands on deck. I think we have over 400 experts from 100 organizations, really trying to link all the dots together to give us a good idea of our progress in restoration for different ecosystems. We realized really right at the start that we needed to think about terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic and transitional ecosystems quite distinctly. I mean, we're going to hear about that today, but I think aquatic ecosystems warrant their own special effort, and it's really great to see, I think, some of the facilitators here have really kickstarted that, what we call then sub-task force, because it's gone a bit quiet, but it's really critical that we double down on our efforts on the aquatic and transitional ecosystems. So, and yeah, just to also mention, we, over the last 3, almost 4 years, we've developed this, what we call the Framework for Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring. And in fact, I did a check yesterday. We have over 250 large-scale restoration initiatives in there from 94 countries, but we only have 3 restoration initiatives from aquatic ecosystems. So you can see we have a lot of work to do. But one of the positive things I did note is we also have a search engine of best practices for restoration across different platforms like Panorama Solutions. And in fact, there are 204 good practices for restoration of aquatic ecosystems. So I think that shows me that there's a body of knowledge on how to restore these ecosystems, but at the moment, we're not picking them up in our global platform for measuring progress. So there's more work to do, and I'll put in the chat actually right now some of the links to these resources that you'll find helpful. So I've put in the chat a link to the firm and also a registration for a follow-up event to this next week on Target 2. Next slide, please. So yeah, at the end of 2022, as I mentioned, a real breakthrough moment actually for biodiversity and for the world is the agreement of governments on the Global Biodiversity Framework, and restoration figured really prominently in this, which is really exciting for us. It gives us a lighthouse for 2030. It's really ambitious. The target 2 is to restore 30% of degraded ecosystems, or have them under effective restoration by 2030. This target, as you can see, clearly identifies inland water and coastal and marine ecosystems. So that's what we're talking about here today. It's really spelled out super clearly in the target. And it comes with a headline indicator, which we call indicator 2.2, which is area under restoration, and FLO, leveraging the Task Force for Monitoring and all the work we've been doing under the UN Decade, is the custodian of that indicator. So it's in our shared interest to try and reach this target, but also really transparently monitor our progress as we implement restoration of these ecosystems. I wanted to mention a few statistics that the colleagues shared with me on aquatic ecosystems, and that they're quite confronting, and I was quite shocked. But you know, the IPBES estimate that like almost 90% of wetlands and inland waters are degraded. I mean, that's pretty astonishing, given that in fact much of our water needs and human well-being depends on those aquatic inland systems. Similarly, marine and coastal ecosystems, there was a study recently that indicated that almost all of the world's oceans have been degraded by human impact. So you can see, and we're up against it, and this degradation of these aquatic ecosystems not only negatively affects the biodiversity, but also threatens the ability of these ecosystems to function and provide services. So not only do we lose out on the biodiversity part, but we lose out on the functional capacity of these ecosystems. So next slide, please. So in this context, it's super clear that we need to restore. I mean, we need to enhance biodiversity, and we need to improve the functional capacity of these ecosystems, the ecosystem functions, and while promoting ecological integrity and connectivity. And currently, most of the progress, I have to say, as I mentioned before, is tilted toward terrestrial ecosystems, but we really need to balance that ledger. And one of the big things that we need through webinars such as today is how we can accelerate and incentivize the restoration of aquatic ecosystems. How can we measure progress? I mean, these are difficult questions which I really hope you as the experts can help us answer. I mean, aquatic ecosystems are really completely different to terrestrial, and inland waters are different to marine ecosystems, right? But we need to find a way to develop sort of robust methodologies across all these ecosystems. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I said, I mean, the reporting and monitoring methodologies that we're developing for the indicator for target 2, they really need to be consistent across the inland and coastal marine, and similarly the aquatic as a whole ecosystem, and the terrestrial to the degree possible, because we really want to undertake large-scale restoration, and we want to transparently monitor this progress that governments have committed to as we move quickly toward 2030. And this is not only for an area-based target such as Target 2, but also an area-based target such as Target 3, which is 30% of area in protection, basically, which will have a similar methodology as Target 2, and I'm sure some of the challenges for aquatic ecosystems are equally relevant to both those targets. And as always, we always build on existing data, existing sustainable development goals that all align very nicely to the 2030 agenda. So really, we're looking forward to listening in, and we really need to make progress. It's a critical year with the CBD substart. The countries, and then the CBD COP, countries will be submitting their national biodiversity action plans, and we really want aquatic ecosystems to feature prominently in those MBSAPs, and for countries to be able to measure progress on the restoration of those aquatic ecosystems in Target 2 and its indicator. Thank you so much. Back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for setting the importance of this webinar so well and so clearly. We are lucky to also have opening remarks from Bethany Walder, the Executive Director of the Society for Ecological Restoration. Bethany.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And thanks, Julian, for that great introduction. It actually, I started taking notes of things I wanted to refer to, but I only have a few minutes. So I think one of the things I want to call out that Julian talked about was the importance of not just measuring biodiversity as we do restoration, but also looking at how aquatic ecosystems provide ecosystem services. So I think it's important to start by understanding how restoration is defined. And the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has defined ecosystem restoration as the process of halting and reversing degradation, resulting in improved ecosystem services and recovered biodiversity. And then they recognize that ecosystem restoration encompasses a wide continuum of practices depending on local conditions and societal choice. So we are, as Julian already said, talking about restoration in all ecosystems, and we're talking about restoration across the entirety of the restorative continuum. So from ecosystem restoration that's focused more on ecosystem services all the way to ecological restoration that may be focused more on biodiversity. But in all cases, we want to do restoration that's going to benefit both nature and people, and how we think about the goal of the UN Decade and the goal of the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework is to focus on restoration that's going to benefit biodiversity and human communities. And we are integrally linked. I didn't even pronounce that right, and I'm a native English speaker, so I apologize for that. And in the context of today's discussion, we also want to understand what the definition of area under restoration is. So Julian also talked quite a bit about not quite a bit, but about the framework on ecosystem monitoring. And there's a lot of concern out there about how do we measure aquatic restoration. And I do want to point out, for starters, that in the work that we've done to help support the framework on ecosystem monitoring through the Global Restoration Observatory and other efforts, we've really worked to try to make sure that the language we're using is agnostic regarding terrestrial or aquatic systems. So instead of saying soils, we say substrate, which could apply to aquatic or terrestrial systems. In the measurement for area, we're talking not just about hectares, but also about linear kilometers. And so if you're working in a riverine ecosystem, you can talk about the linear kilometers of the area in a linear kilometer measurement, not just in a square kilometer measurement. So we're trying to make sure that we're doing this in an inclusive way. But I would say, Julian, and I would challenge you as I close my comments, that our roadmap is also terrestrially defined. And we might want to think, as we talk about our plan collectively, globally for Target 2 and how to achieve this global target, that we even think about language that's also a little bit more neutral than just a roadmap for achieving Target 2. So this webinar, I think, is going to look at a lot of things. We have incredible speakers today, and I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say and how we think about that definition of restoration and recognize that it's about not fixing everything, but putting nature back on the trajectory it was on before it was degraded, and in a manner that supports both ecosystem services and biodiversity. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bethany. Your perspective and the advocacy for aquatic systems, the inspiration are greatly appreciated. So we are ready for the panel and the discussion. I turn it over to my colleague, Kim Friedman, Fisheries Division here at FAO, to briefly introduce the first panelist. But before I do, I want to thank him for all his help developing the webinar, putting together how we're going to make it work, and I look forward to moderating the discussion together soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. After those very illuminating introductions, it's time to welcome our first webinar presenter, Bose Hancock, who's the Senior Marine Restoration Scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Global Oceans team. You'll find more information detailed about Bose in the chat and of the other participants. But let's welcome Bose for his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Kim. Yeah, I'd like to start with just the very briefest of introductions to marine habitat restoration. And I'll try and use oyster reef and seagrass as examples. I do need to point out that the work I'm presenting is not just mine. I'm actually representing the marine restoration community. And before I leave this slide, that is a picture of a barge deploying substrate for oyster reef restoration in Gulf St. Vincent in South Australia. Next slide, please. But most of the marine habitat restoration that we've been involved in is coastal. And I tend to talk about it in terms of the critical coastal ecosystems. And within that, there are the 4 vegetated habitats, the salt marsh, seagrass, mangroves, and the giant kelps. And next slide, along with the reef systems, predominantly the coral reefs and the shellfish reefs. And it's worth pointing out that these are ecological equivalents. The coral reefs occur in nice clean water, it's warm, it's tropical, and people have a mental picture of coral reefs. We don't tend to have a mental picture of the shellfish reefs, and that's partly because they dominate in temperate waters. It's cooler, the visibility is not nearly as good, but also because they are largely absent. They've really been fished out. So next slide, please. We've lost a global study completed in 2011, a while ago now, determined that oyster reef we had lost over 85% globally. But when we dive into some regional studies and start looking at areas like Southern Australia, Europe, the US West Coast, large regions where we have lost over 99% of that habitat, it's essentially gone. Seagrass habitat, we're better off, but we've still lost over 50% of seagrass habitat globally. Next slide, please. And as has been pointed out, and I'm sure this audience knows full well, that the reason that's an issue is because along with that habitat, we've lost all of those services that the habitat provides. For both seagrass and oyster reef, it's things like water quality, filtration, nutrient mitigation, greenhouse gas sequestration. Importantly, fish production, fisheries support, biodiversity, coastal protection, right through to the economic benefits we get from job creation and direct economic support. Next, please. If we're talking shellfish habitats, most of the decline was due to fishing and overfishing. It's when steam engines went into the dredge fleet, essentially in the mid 1800s, that dredge boats were no longer tied to sail power and could go out and actually mine out these resources, which they did very effectively. Harvested the oysters, sold those oysters, but what was left was actually thousands of generations of oyster shells, which turns out to be a pretty valuable source of lime for the building industry. So the dredge fleet went back out and dredged up all of the reef base and sold the shell to the lime kilns to produce mortar for building. So there was complete destruction of that habitat. Next slide, please. So the restoration process is actually the reverse of that overfishing process. We first install the reef base, recreate a reef structure and add to it the biology, and go about monitoring the progress of the sites. And the project that I'd like to just highlight briefly is in Australia, the Reef Builder program in Australia. And what the Australian team did was go out and actually map out all of the bays and estuaries that had been supported historically by large oyster reef networks. And with over 99% loss, obviously that's a collapsed habitat, that's historical information. But the next question that they asked was, what would it take to get the oyster reefs of Southern Australia off an IUCN red list? So at 99% or over 99% loss, that's a collapsed habitat in terms of the IUCN red listing. So the question was, what would it take to get the habitat off that red list? And the answer was restoration of reefs to 30 bays and estuaries around Southern Australia. So the Reef Builder program is a partnership between the Australian government, both federal and state governments, and the restoration community led by the Nature Conservancy. And they have currently restored 13 of the bays around Australia, 13 of that target 60. So well underway to the 30% restoration. Next slide, please. So the next habitat I'll touch on very, very briefly is seagrass. And you can see on the map of the US there, Washington, the capital on the central east coast, and the expanded view on the right-hand side. Washington's on Chesapeake Bay, but what I'll be describing is the Atlantic coast of Chesapeake Bay and the Virginia Coast Reserve. Next slide, please. This is an area that TNC has been restoring terrestrial habitats for many decades, since the 50s. It was also home to vast seagrass meadows historically. They actually started to suffer a long time ago. It was in the 1930s. There was an introduced disease, was knocking back the seagrass populations, and a serious hurricane in 1933 finished off that habitat. It wasn't until the late 90s that Virginia Institute of Marine Science started to look at what might be required to restore some of that habitat. And teamed up with TNC in the early 2000s, and have been working for 25 years now at restoring seagrass habitats in those bays and estuaries, and currently have the world's largest seagrass restoration program there. Next slide, please. The technique that was developed by VIMS and TNC was actually maturing seed for direct seeding. So the seed pods of a seagrass break off from the stem, they float, that's the dispersal phase, and it takes the seeds of this particular species 3 or 4 months to mature. And when the seeds are mature, they drop out of the pod, and they are heavy, they sink to the bottom and germinate. So what we were doing at the Virginia Coast Reserve was harvesting those seed pods, getting them into aquaculture facilities to mature those pods, and collect the seeds once the pods have matured and the seeds drop out, and collect the seeds from the bottom of those tanks for direct seeding. Next slide, please. This is a chart of the coastal bays. It's a mosaic of charts to fit it all in. Don't worry too much about the details there. On the left-hand side, you might be able to see just a couple of the very small green dots, which represent the first of the restoration plots put into the Virginia Coast Reserve, and that was in '98. The next slide is 2001. You can see that area has started to expand and more restoration plots. Next slide, 2004. The next one, 07. Next is 2010. Next, 13, next 15, next 18, and you can see over time the number of restoration plots expanding, but also the expansion by rhizome growth and self-seeding of those restored beds. So by 2024, we've got 290 hectares that have actually been directly seeded into the Virginia Coast Reserves, and that's resulted in nearly 4,000 hectares of actual seagrass footprint within that system. Next slide, please. So the last point I'd like to make is that, you know, part of the biodiversity that's associated with that particular habitat, and these are the ecosystem engineers, these critical coastal habitats, one of the species that relies on that is the bay scallop. In the 1930s, Virginia had the largest bay scallop fishery in the US, 91 million scallops harvested out of those bays in 1930, and that completely disappeared along with the eelgrass. So we are actively restoring the scallops now that that habitat has been returned, and I look forward to seeing what the scallop population looks like by 1930. So that's an incredibly brief introduction to a couple of habitats. But please jot down questions. I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. Right on time. It's really useful to hear these experiences and to see your successes. And also, as we try to understand, even just, for example, seagrass and oyster reef restoration, I think it's really helpful to see it so we can think about how to measure and monitor these kinds of restoration. And I'll note someone posted in the chat just at the end of your presentation, amazing graphics and explanations. That's really fun. I want to make a quick note to all the participants. Welcome. I'm thrilled to see this active discussion in the chat. So your questions to the panelists don't get lost. If you could please remember to post questions for the panelists in the Q&A box, not just in the chat. You're welcome to put them in the chat too, but for the panelists, also the Q&A box. That would be great. So I'd now like to welcome our next panelist, Carlos Alberto Rivera Rondon. He's the associate professor in the Department of Biology at the Pontifical Javeriana University of Colombia. Welcome, Carlos. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to present some reflections derived from the wetland restoration exercise in Colombia, but above all, from the experience and understanding of freshwater tropical aquatic ecosystems. Next, please. Firstly, it is necessary to acknowledge the vast diversity of wetlands in the neotropical regions. Particularly in Colombia, a 2019 study identified more than 80 types of wetlands. But I will not explain everyone here. But wetland can be broadly categorized into three basic types. Mountain wetlands, found mainly in a unique ecosystem known as paramus, and lowland wetlands situated in floodplains, and urban wetlands. This classification, although simplistic, helps us to understand the primary factor affecting wetlands. Each ecosystem type has key structural elements being affected by various structures. For instance, mountains wetland heavily relied on atmospheric pollution, seasonal rainfall, and land use in the nearby watersheds. In contrast, floodplain wetlands are connected to river flood and depend on the hydrological pulse. Also, by connectivity and habitat diversity. On the other hand, urban wetlands are heavily impacted ecosystems, requiring a focus on preserving habitat heterogeneity and connectivity. Therefore, every kind of wetland have different impact. For example, mountain wetlands are very impact for atmospheric depositions, and floodplain wetlands are affected by the construction of reservoirs and the water quality of the big rivers. And urban wetlands are very affected by the changes in the connectivity between small reservoirs. Therefore, before starting any restoration efforts, it is crucial to classify the different wetland types to identify which structural aspects are most sensitive to anthropogenic stressors. Next, please. How much restoration of wetland has been made in Colombia? Unfortunately, very little has been accomplished, and the extent varies depend on the wetland type. For example, in some floodplain wetlands, channel has been directed to enhance river water body connectivity. However, in many cases, actions are limited to reforesting the ecosystem watershed, with minimal monitoring of aquatic ecosystem follow-up objective. Typically, monitoring focus on vegetation changes in the basin or the hydraulic dynamic recovery. Therefore, we have to focus to identify indicators on the water ecosystem, such as aquatic vegetation, chemical composition, plankton communities, and other more related to water. Harbor wetland restoration has proven more complex, mainly due to the flood control efforts, often resulting in disconnecting wetland from river to prevent wastewater inflow. Main action have aimed at enhanced flood buffering capacity, conserving diversity, and ensuring recreational opportunities, particularly in city wetlands. Fish production is a primary concern in floodplain wetland. Yet action mainly revolves around increased channel connectivity. The challenge is the lack of data knowledge regarding how fish population respond to hydraulic dynamics. Therefore, the area of the floodplain is very important for fish productivity, and the fish is very important for poorest people in Colombia wetland, that they usually take the protein only from fishing. Ultimately, many forms remain confined to watershed reforestation due to the high cost associated with large water body intervention. Next, please. Given the limited documented exercise, how can future restoration process in tropical wetland be improved? Next, please, thank you. Several aspects must be considered, including wetland ontogeny, realistic outcome possibilities, actions, and their implementation. Understanding the natural ontogeny of wetland ecosystem is crucial. Natural processes like progressive clogging, trophic state increase, and filling are inherent to all wetlands. Naturally, they alternate between a state dominated by submerged vegetation and those dominated by planktonic algae. However, as depth reduces over time, this variability reduces too, resulting in an irreversible aging. They lose this natural capacity for variation and gradually become a shallow ecosystem with rot or floating species such as the water hyacinth. Next, please. Thank you. How do we incorporate wetland age into restorative effort? We have to think that wetlands are not the same that we knew some years ago. We anticipate reaching a point of no return where implemented action cannot fully restore wetland to a previous state. Restoration strictly defined becomes feasible only when the system can revert to a regime shift scenarios. Long-term stressor may only allow partial service rehabilitation, but a wetland depth significantly reduced due to prolonged stress, returning to past scenario becoming unviable, requiring the ecosystem redesign. Thinking about redesigned wetlands sounds like we are redesigning it as assuming or inability to compensate for some of the anthropic impact. But it's perhaps the most viable way to restore some of the values of function that this ecosystem have. Additionally, next please. Wetlands should be integrated into landscape, considering river connection, seasonal variation. Here, this is a sketch about how this floodplain wetland we can identify different zones like the nearby basin, the flood zone, the littoral zone, the body water, the connection with the canal of the river, the overflow zone, the main river, of course, and the basin of the main river. And for each one, we can identify the stressor factors. We can identify the ecosystem service that they are providing. And also we can identify the area that we can restore in every one. Therefore, proper zoning of different areas within floodplain wetlands consider ecosystem service and anthropogenic factor is crucial for an effective action planning. Next, please. Global change also introduced additional complexity affecting wetlands different over time. Each aspect of global change may impact wetlands uniquely. Some of the impacts are, for example, the oxygenation, increased seasonality of lake levels, increased productivity and sedimentation, and the affectation of the food webs. Therefore, the global change factor increase the age of wetland since they affect the quantity of organic matter, the sediment, and the situation in general of the ecosystem. And therefore, restoration plans should anticipate these impacts and aim to mitigate them effectively. Next. So how can we think of a restoration plan that considers all these factors? Consider these factors next. Thank you. Must probably identify initially the stressor factors that are affecting every zone of each wetland. And therefore, supported by local communities, working with the local communities, is possible to prioritize crucial ecosystem service. And therefore, propose action, and that action have to be located in special zones or in every zone of the wetland. Therefore, it could be possible to have an indicator of area if we can identify the area that have to be restored in every wetland. Ultimately, the goal is for wetland to offer a wider array of service, but this requires deep ecosystem understanding. Next, please. Then, in a tropical region like Colombia, where baseline study, monitoring program, and ecosystem process knowledge are lacking, addressing this gap is critical for effective wetland restoration. Through this comprehensive understanding, we can develop target action for each wetland zone. Then we have to identify the main ecosystem service, which are the main key structural elements, the stressors, and then define measure for each zone. Okay, thank you. Next, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was fantastic. We're really grateful for your experience in restoring Colombian wetlands. Especially, I appreciated how you spoke about how they shift over time and therefore the importance of incorporating temporal variability in this restoration planning and monitoring. And we've already gotten a question about opportunities for harmonizing wetland definitions and incorporating carbon storage in wetlands when we're doing restoration planning. So thank you very much. I'm happy now to introduce Leonard Aquani, Freshwater Director for Africa at Conservation International. And I note that more detailed bios for all our panelists are being put in the chat so you can refer to them. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I will go straight away and share my presentation, which is on restoration of lakes, rivers, and fringing papyrus wetlands in Lake Victoria. And of course, this covers the River Nile basin. Next slide. Now, freshwater ecosystem restoration is very critical for Africa because within the continent of Africa, we have critical mass or critical size of freshwater ecosystems, be they lakes, be they rivers, be they wetlands, be they peatlands. We have them in Africa, the continent of Africa. inland freshwater ecosystems offers multiple ecosystem services that are very critical for human beings and also hosts a lot of biodiversity. Whether you want to look at it in terms of water supply, whether you want to look at it in terms of fisheries, whether you want to look at it in terms of other livelihoods that these inland freshwater ecosystems provide. But under that, there is a lot of threat that is threatening these services and that is threatening these freshwater ecosystems in Africa. And this is driven by population increase, urbanization that is really occurring in many areas in Africa. And then, of course, there is issue of climate change, which is really affecting these ecosystem services, either through precipitation changes, temperature changes, and many others. That freshwater ecosystems also is at the heart of water security for the store and supply water use, water for use, and then recharge aquifers and rivers and all those freshwater ecosystems. So there is really need, urgent need for inland freshwater ecosystem restoration, sustainable use of the same, and management. Next slide, please. If we appraise the issue of freshwater ecosystems and issues of restoration, what we find from the report that we develop is that there are challenges that are facing restoration or issues of freshwater ecosystems in Africa. One of these is baseline information, whether in terms of restoration, the freshwater ecosystem status, or in terms of the progress we are making on restoration. So there is lack of baseline information to inform restoration, but also to inform conservation of these freshwater ecosystem services. And then there is overall degradation that is going on. Pollution, siltation is very key. Also plastics is a big challenge in these freshwater ecosystems. Invasive species, we have both in terms of flora and fauna, which are really impacting on freshwater ecosystem quality and performance. There's issue of infrastructure that is threatening the green infrastructure that are associated with freshwater ecosystems. And then cage aquaculture, which is strongly coming into our freshwater ecosystems in Africa, and has issues of biosecurity or issues of adding more nutrients in already saturated systems. And then extraction of minerals, which then pours their wastes into these aquatic ecosystems. There is peat for energy in Africa, which we see mostly in peatlands areas, river and areas that affects those ecosystems. Climate change, which I've mentioned. And then, of course, in terms of governance, there is overlapping or conflicting governance instruments, especially within transboundary areas of these freshwater ecosystems. And then that collaboration, because scale, as you will hear from my presentation, scale is a very key issue, but we find that through this conflicting and minimal collaborations as a challenge, we are not doing much within to protect and restore these freshwater ecosystems. But there are inspiring case studies with regards to restoration of these freshwater ecosystems. We have an instance of a wetland, urban wetland, being restored or reclaimed from an industrial park. We have wetland atlases being generated in many parts of Africa, providing information on these freshwater ecosystems for action. We have management plans and conservation investment plans, which are being developed to inform conservation, and restoration is one of the strategic actions in those investments or in those freshwater management plans. And then economic evaluation, providing economic sense or economic rationale for conservation or for restoration of those freshwater ecosystem. We also see proactive, responsive national policies coming in. And then, of course, reawakening of dry wetlands, conservation of dry wetlands for the role they play in ecosystem services, and also supporting the economies of those dry areas. And then, of course, issues of environmental flows and reserve coming in legislation or coming in policies, because these environmental flows and reserve are very key in restoration of these aquatic ecosystems in Africa. But of course, the big issue here is scale. Scale is a big issue for us to have a meaningful impact. Next slide, please. This is a classic example of a degradation of, this is peat for energy, a classic degradation threat to an aquatic system. We can see Kagera River down there, and then we can see harvesting of peat, which will then really interfere with this aquatic ecosystem, a riverine ecosystem. And therefore, the question is, how do we restore this kind of ecosystem so that it continue providing ecosystem services? And then, of course, managing this industrial level of peat to energy harvesting. Next slide, please. And then with restoration, from our work, we find that there are key elements that are very critical for restoration. Extent or area restoration, we need to look at the extent of the area that we are restoring, quality in terms of nutrients that then will enable that aquatic systems to perform the functions that it's supposed to perform if the quality is maintained. Issues of quality, quantity, flow of water in the right quantity for biodiversity, also for human consumption. And then there is freshwater biodiversity, which is very key when you're talking of restoration of these aquatic ecosystems in Africa. And then freshwater fisheries is a very key element of inland freshwater ecosystems. This needs to be part and parcel of what we monitor as we conserve these areas. And then, of course, the utility value of such, whether for recreational purposes, that then can then inform how we are restoring our aquatic ecosystems. Next slide, please. So inland freshwater ecosystem, if we look at it in context, there is intense interaction with the surrounding environment, the surrounding catchment, with the surrounding watershed. And therefore, we really need to look at externalities that comes as a result of its connection with the catchment, with the surroundings, so that even as we do our restoration, we need to factor those externalities so that our restoration is not partial, like restoring a mouth of a river, and then there are a lot of impact coming from the catchment. So we need to look at the context and to which these inland freshwater ecosystems occur. This is very key in informing the kind of restoration and the kind of scale that we need to work on. Next slide, please. Just to give one example of a restoration that Conservation International and other partners are doing is on issues of restoring fish breeding areas. Lake Victoria is shared by three countries. So we are taking that part of Kenya. So fish breeding areas have been mapped, but these fish breeding areas, there's a lot of impact in the waters. There's a lot of impact in the riparian areas. So we are working towards restoration of these fish breeding areas from the Kenyan side, starting with the south western part of it. Next slide, please. And what we are doing is that working with the core management structures, working with aquaculture farms that are there, we are moving into these fish breeding areas which have been mapped, and then designing conservation, restoration actions to ensure that fish thrives and to ensure that the aquatic environment is restored. Next slide, please. So we are zoning these areas into the riparian area. This is an area basically of fringing papyrus wetlands, and very key in fish breeding, and also very key into blocking restoration and other wastes from impacting on the lake water. So we have the restoration area, the yellow part, and the fish breeding zone where there is no tech, and then of course the right fishing zone. Working with the core management structures, we are designing this restoration zonation so that we can work on it and restore this area. Next slide. This is also another area, a riparian area, and then right fishing zone, and then the fish breeding area that we are restoring. Next slide, please. And then, of course, once we have the riparian area, this is a classic example of what we do, restoring this area, especially with indigenous vegetation that is adapted to this area. So we are working with the communities to restore these riparian areas for fish breeding, but also to block soil and siltation from moving into the lake. And of course, wetlands also has those functions of purifying waste. So this we do through working with the common management structure. Next slide, please. And then other aspect of it also is, as I said, also restoration involves biodiversity. So we are harvesting, we are taking native species of fish. This is Oreochromis exquilentas, working with the community and working with other partners. We are restoring these areas that with the native species that has really declined in this area. Next slide, please. And we are working in a partnership. Next slide, please. And that there are other freshwater ecosystem restoration initiatives in Africa, whether you want to look at it, the Ruaha River in Tanzania, where they're working on the catchment, Nairobi River, where they're working on sewage and banks restoration, urban wetland restoration from industrial park, transboundary wetlands and peatlands in the Nile Basin, developing transboundary management and investment plans to restore those areas. And then, of course, wetlands restoration in Lake Alautra. Wetlands are very key for the survival of this lake because they hold siltation from filling up this small lake, but very critical in fisheries. So they are restoring those wetlands. But issues of impact, if the impact has been measured, to share. Issues of scale, as I mentioned earlier, is very critical. And then climate change is really impacting and bringing a lot of challenges. And then sustainability. Sustainability of this restoration exercise becomes very critical. Next slide, please. So there are many challenges. If you look at Julian's presentation on the socioeconomic box, there are many challenges. Restoration is not just hardware kind of work. There are many social governance challenges that are related, either between, if you are conserving a bilateral transboundary area, if there is political bilateral tension, we find this will really impact on what you are conserving. If there are conflicting land uses, for instance, one country want to conserve their peatlands, the other country want to harvest them for peat or for agriculture. Those are challenges that are being faced when we are working at scale in restoration of this freshwater aquatic environment. And of course, communicable, some of these areas have communicable diseases. Like one area we worked on had these issues of Ebola, and therefore working in such kind of areas becomes a challenge. But all in all, we can say that Africa has a huge potential for restoration of inland freshwater ecosystems. So we really need to work on this potential and push it to a reasonable scale to actualize these services. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you. That was great. Thank you for highlighting the essential and the urgent need for inland freshwater restoration in Africa. I think we all know that what gets measured gets done. And so that makes our discussion and your experience about how to measure and monitor this aquatic restoration so important. We've already gotten an unbelievable number of questions in the chat. So I hope we're going to get a chance to answer a lot of them. During your presentation, they were coming in, especially on integration of flood control and issues with invasive species like water hyacinth and how that pertains to restoration in Africa. And thank you also for being very explicit about the need for cross-disciplinary collaboration and being honest about the challenges ahead. That's really important to keep in mind. So our next panelist will be Andreas Nemmert. He's the project manager and a freshwater geoinformatician at Revital Integrative Nature Planning. Thank you, Andreas, for joining us.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you for your introduction. Hi to everyone. Next slide, please. My name is Andreas, and the company I'm working for is called Revital, and we are situated in Europe. Next one in Eastern Tyrol in Austria. And I'm going to speak today about river restoration of alpine rivers. Next one, please. But before we start talking about the river restoration, we have to look back decades and centuries ago. Rivers looked like on the upper right side. We have an example of the Salzach River. The river had space. We had a lot of branches, side branches, small streams, We had place for hardwood forest, softwood forest, all different kind of habitats. Next one, but then we started to regulate the rivers, and they mainly, or a lot of rivers look like on the lower right side. But then problems started. Due to the regulation, we have a lot of loss of retention areas, a lot of flooding happened. We lost the biodiversity. The water quality decreased. The groundwater level got down, and we lost a lot of recreational areas. Nowadays, we know about these problems, and so we started with the river restoration. Next one. But if we think about river restoration, like Leonard said before, the river system is very complex. If you change one small component, for example, the bed load, it has a massive effect on the entire system. So let me show you an example. On the left-hand side, you have two pictures. In the upper picture, it is the River Drava before hydropower plants were built on the river. Down the picture shows the situation like it is right now after building the hydropower plants. On the next slide, we did some measurements on pioneer habitats. You see the yellow areas are the areas of pioneer habitats before the hydropower plants were built. And because of the reduction of the bed load discharge, we have a massive loss of pioneer habitats. You see nowadays the red areas are the pioneer habitats like they are right now. We have a loss of 80% of these habitats. The River Drava developed from a multi-channel river to a single-channel river. And as we know, rivers are a complex system. Each river is very specific. Every situation is different. And to solve these problems and talk about river restoration, you have to work with an interdisciplinary expert team. Next slide, please. In our company, when we are talking about river restoration, we always talk about the river corridor. Not only the river corridor that can be described by the floodplain maybe, but we also talk about the multifunctional river corridor. So what does this mean? We try to use several synergies between different needs of this river corridor. For example, we need space for flood protection. We need space for ecology, for the groundwater body and recreation. On the next slide, you see in a red dotted line, the area or the surrounding of the area of the river corridor. And within this river corridor, we try to fulfill all the needs of different sections like flood protection, ecology, and so on. On the next slide, I give you a short overview about the legal framework. Like you know, in the European Union, we have this Water Framework Directive that says we have to fulfill or achieve the good ecological status of the water bodies. And coming to Austria, how can we finance this kind of river restorations? So we have this disaster fund. There we use the synergies between flood protection projects and river restoration projects. Then we have this Environmental Promotion Act where we can finance river restoration. And another part is that we finance the river restoration via compensation measures. That means when big infrastructure projects like railways, streets, or whatever are built, companies have to build compensation measures. And we can use it for river restoration. On the next slide, I give a short overview about the main 4 measure types of river restoration. So we have this technology of soft banks. There we dig out the embankment. In the foreland, we build a hidden embankment or hidden groins. And by putting away the embankment, we give the river the chance to mobilize the sediment and widen itself after the next flood or during the next flood. The second possibility is the mechanical widening. That's also the same procedure like that we dig away the embankment with an excavator, but we speed up the river widening with the excavator. Another possibility is the initial channel. So we dig parallel to the main channel and initial channel, and in the next flooding, the river can widen itself and erode the embankment and widen the area. The last one is the lowering of the forevent. It's more or less the same like the mechanical widening. Okay, and next slide, please. So we also deal with a lot of challenges when we are talking about river restoration of alpine rivers. The main challenge is, like you can see here, is the land purchase. We have a lot of pressure on the available land, like you see here. We have a lot of farmland there, a lot of meadows, but there are also drinking water supplies and so on included in this area. On the left side is the Alpenrhein before revitalization, and on the right side there is a future picture. Maybe, hopefully, it will look like after our revitalization, and you can get an impression on how much space we need for this river restoration. But again, with this river corridor and the synergy effects, the multifunctional river corridor, we can handle this. Then we have other topics like complex legal topics, technical issues, and different interests, but the main challenge is the land purchase. Coming to the next slide, shows the River Drava in Obergottesfeld, also in Austria. We have three different epochs. We have on the left side the River Drava before river revitalization. We have a straight river in the middle. We have the River Drava during the implementation of the restoration sites. We can see first initial channels. We can see lowering of the foreland. And on the right side, we have the picture like it is maybe 10 to 12, 13 years after starting the implementation. We have initial channels. We have initial channels that are not connected with the main channel. So we have groundwater initial channels. We have flood throws. So we have all different kind of core habitats. And on the next slide, you can see how it looks like now. It is an image from last week. We have a huge problem with river bed deepening in this area on the right side where the red arrow is. This shows the river width before revitalization, and now we have 5 or 6 times the width of the river for the River Drava back. So we stopped the riverbed deepening. We have a very huge retention area. We have ecological core habitats, like you see, a lot of gravel bars, all different kind of status of the wood. We have a good recreation area. People go there, sit at the water, have a hike there. And we have a good groundwater resource there because we brought the groundwater level up to the level it was before river bed deepening. So on the next slide, I can give you an example of 2 monitoring possibilities like they are established in Austria right now. We have this ecological monitoring. So we monitor bioindicators like fish, macrozoobenthos, hydromorphology, chemical physical parameters. Or we can have these indicators we monitor like biodiversity, flood protection, groundwater level, or recreational use. These are small-scale monitoring for local or regional monitoring possibilities, but we can also think about a broader possibility to monitor this automatic large-scale monitoring so that we indicate habitats, how they change, or the land use, how it changes. Again, within this river corridor. And on the next slide, I have an example of this automatic large-scale monitoring we did on the River Isar. There we detected FFH habitat types, and we combined them over the years, and now we see how these FFH types changed in course of the area over the years. So if you think about large-scale monitoring that is nationwide or Europe-wide, we can think about monitoring of a very large, cost-efficient possibility with this large-scale monitoring. Yeah, that's how we do river restoration of alpine river. Thank you for the possibility to speak about our possibilities, how to do the restoration. And I hand over to Kim. I think he's responsible for the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, for sharing those alpine river revitalization projects and talking to what happened with overregulation and loss of biodiversity due to actions in the past, but also linking it to the large-scale monitoring tasks and how one component changes and has downstream impacts across multiple elements, including loss of interconnected habitats. So again, multidisciplinary teams was heralded, and you mentioned the challenges of raising finances for the restoration work needed. So we're making pretty good time. So please carry on putting questions in the chat. And if we don't have time to answer them all, we will bring them to future discussions. I'm now happy to introduce Cynthia Catton, Aquatic Science Advisor for the Washington Department of Natural Resources of USA. Again, if you're looking for more information on the speakers, please find a more detailed bio in the chat. Cynthia, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for this invitation to share out about the kelp and eelgrass conservation and recovery in Washington State. This is on the Pacific coast of the US rather than the Atlantic coast that Bose had been talking about before. And I work for the state agency that is responsible for managing over 10,000 square kilometers of state-owned aquatic land, which much of it includes kelp and eelgrass habitats in the marine near shore. Next slide, please. This is a map of our coastline, which includes a very complex inner basin of Puget Sound, as well as the outer coast and some coastal estuaries. And the Puget Sound area in particular is a combination of urban and rural watersheds. The dark area in the map is the entire watershed for Puget Sound that flows into the water area in the middle. And I wanted to point out that this is the Puget Sound is the largest estuary by volume in the lower 48 states in the United States. And some early estimates of the natural capital for that whole Puget Sound basin that's highlighted in the map is quite large, in the billions to trillions of dollars. So the natural areas are supporting the rapidly growing population in this area in Washington State and a vibrant economy. Next slide, please. When we're talking about the marine nearshore vegetated habitats in Washington State, we're talking about a narrow band of vegetation of kelp and eelgrass or seagrass meadows. Eelgrass is one species of seagrass in Washington, and that follow the contour of the coastline. These are important migratory corridors for critical species of salmon, which is culturally really foundational to the Pacific Northwest. The kelp and eelgrass habitats themselves are also the foundations of cultures, economies, and ecosystems in our area. So really critical habitats to be focused on conservation and recovery. These, because, oh, we're gonna go back one more slide. Because this is this narrow band along the coastline, it is situated at the interface between land and ocean. And so there's an influence of both on the dynamics of these habitats. So next slide, please. When I'm talking about kelp forests and seagrass meadows, this is some underwater photos of them. We have a couple of different form factors of kelp. We have the floating kelp species of giant kelp and bull kelp that reach the surface. And then we also have understory kelp, which don't reach the surface typically, but make a complex, together make a complex habitat for fish and invertebrates and marine mammals and seabirds. Really diverse ecosystem. Seagrass meadows are also important nursery habitats for a lot of fish species. And together, the seagrass and the kelp forests create a mosaic of vegetated habitats along that marine nearshore corridor. Next slide, please. A couple of years ago, we were directed by our state legislature. DNR was directed to develop a health and conservation plan for kelp forests and eelgrass meadows in Washington state to protect and recover at least 40 square kilometers of priority kelp and eelgrass habitat by 2040. And we have been working with broadly across the recovery community to identify what are the key ecosystem services that we want to be protecting and recovering, including cultural, ecological, and economic ecosystem services. And we will be working closely with local partners to identify key sites for that work. When we're thinking about what does it mean to conserve or recover or restore in Puget Sound in particular, but I think anywhere along this coastline, we are recognizing that that we have to address the major stressors of the system in order to be successful in maintaining the habitat area that we have or enhancing it. So so that's a big focus of our work, is to learn more about the stressors that we can reduce and the effects of those cumulative stressors on the system. Because we're talking about metrics and rolling up our understanding of habitat area into a global framework, the 40 square kilometers of priority native kelp habitats is partially contributing to the global kelp forest challenge that the Kelp Forest Alliance put forward a couple of years ago. Next slide, please. In Puget Sound, we are working closely with our partners at the Puget Sound Partnership, which is another Washington state agency that has been leading out on an effort to develop a broad framework for measuring and tracking Puget Sound recovery, which includes not just habitat metrics, but also water quality, human well-being metrics, and those are shown in that big colorful square on the right. And I'm going to be talking about those metrics that we've been developing for the beaches and marine vegetation vital signs that are described on the left-hand side. So we've got a couple of eelgrass focused vital sign indicators. One is eelgrass area, and the other is short and long-term change at eelgrass sites that are index sites. And then for kelp, we have recently developed a floating kelp bed area indicator. We have recognized the need for an understory kelp vital sign indicator, but we do not have data on those understory kelp species yet to inform that. We have with the vital sign indicators, we also have kind of a stoplight indicator approach to what do we understand about the status of those for eelgrass area. We are seeing no trend, whereas when we look at the short and long-term changes in eelgrass sites, we see mixed results. We see that the floating kelp bed area is getting worse. We're in the process of developing targets for most of these as well. Next slide. So I'll go into what's informing those vital sign indicators and status bubbles. For the eelgrass, we monitor multiple sites, over 200 sites, all around Puget Sound. These are randomized locations in 3 subbasins, and the dots on the map show where we have sampled. We do we tow an underwater camera behind our boat, and we do offshore transects at each of these sites and get an area estimate at each site over time. And you can see that there's some areas that we've seen declining, some areas we've seen increasing, some areas that are no trend. So next slide, please. And if we rolling that up into these 2 different kinds of indicators, the whole Puget Sound eelgrass area indicator graph is on the left. And we see basically almost no change in the overall area estimate for eelgrass in Puget Sound. You can convince yourself that there's a slight decline in recent years, but it's very slight. When we look at the information at a regional scale, that's sub-basin scale, then we start to see that maybe that broader view of Puget Sound eelgrass area we're missing an important piece of the story, because we're actually seeing at the sub-basin scale or regional scale that there are areas of concern, that there's in particular in the north part of the Puget Sound, in the San Juan Islands and the Strait, we're seeing more sites that are declining than we see increasing. These are highly variable systems, annually variable habitats, and so we do expect some to increase and some to decrease, but we should be expecting that to kind of balance out. And we're seeing in that north part of the sound that the decreasing number of sites is far outweighing the increasing. So that's cause to pay attention.
Cynthia,
Next
can
slide,
I
please.
ask you just if you can wrap it up in just 30 seconds, that would be
Absolutely.
great. Thank you.
Yep. Next slide. Similarly, for the statewide floating kelp bed area, we have been using multiple sources of information to bring together our understanding of whether the sites are increasing or decreasing, or if we have enough information to support a status call. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we have the kelp and eelgrass habitats that are forming a critical mosaic of nearshore vegetated habitats. We are tracking recovery and identifying the meaningful targets based on historical knowledge and long-term monitoring. And we want to design metrics that integrate multiple ways of knowing and maximize our insights across broad geographic areas on long timeframes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We hear this idea again about the importance of monitoring and measuring over time, especially in aquatic ecosystems, I believe. So thank you, Cynthia. It's really exciting to see all the work on kelp and eelgrass restoration. And for me, especially to see the diversity of kelp and all these really innovative methods for monitoring. I thought the underwater videography was really fascinating. And I think we all have to really spend moments to learn from the experience across different reporting and monitoring efforts. So thank you for sharing all of those. And I want to thank again all the panelists. And we're now going to begin the panel discussion, the Q&A. And of course, there is never enough time. I think that's a universal from these webinars. But I really want to start with something maybe quick, so we get all the panelists speaking very quickly. So a 30-second response, super fast if we can get it to happen. And I want to ask, thinking of one of the projects you just presented or your favorite project, very quickly, 30 seconds, what is the difference in magnitude between the area that you manipulate during the restoration? That's one definition, and the area over which the flow of goods and services is restored. So to make it go fast, let's just go in the order of speakers. And with just 30 seconds, how different are these areas?
So for the marine systems that I described, the shellfish and the seagrass, very different. The footprint of the restoration that I was describing for either of those habitats is much smaller than the area of the bay, the area of the system. And if we're talking fish production, we're talking nutrient mitigation, we're talking recreational fishing, commercial opportunities, that happens on at least the bay scale and probably bigger. So, defining what the boundaries of that area are is actually difficult, but it's certainly much bigger than the footprint of the restoration. I think the default would be the bay or estuary system that you're working within.
Okay, I think in restoration in wetland, in floodplain wetland, for example, action related to fish production also have an impact in a few basins. For example, big rivers like Magdalena or Cauca in Colombia depend on the productivity of wetland. Their action in a small wetland can have a very strong impact in the productivity of the whole basin. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, same as both. Our interventions are in comparatively with Lake Victoria, which is over 68,000 kilometers square, based on what we are acting on, which is an area we are targeting, an area of 1,400 kilometers square. So we are really working on a small area compared to where the impact will go or where the impact is felt. And therefore, issues of connectivity becomes very key, but then also issues of scale, so that what we are acting on then can have an impact in the area we're intervening, and then, of course, have that ripple effect in the entire freshwater ecosystem. Thank you.
Yeah, I showed you today an example of the Upper Trava where we did the restoration, and the Upper Trava is approximately 70 kilometers long, and we estimate that around 50% of this 70 kilometers still was restored, at least at one side, not on both sides, but as we heard today, it also has impacts on the downstream and on the upstream area if you're doing restorations. And if we have the comparison to Austria, we estimated in 1 year, we are doing restoration of river sites about 30 to 50 kilometers.
And I'm thinking about the flow of goods as kind of equivalent to ecosystem services. I think ecosystem services themselves have different scales that they are operating at. If we're talking about carbon storage, we're talking about maybe a global scale of mitigating climate change. We're talking about the food web dynamics, then we're talking about more local scales, but it can vary depending on where, the complexity of that food web. So I think I'm agreeing with all the panelists that it's large compared to the scale of the restoration, but depending on which ecosystem service you're aiming for, or a suite of ecosystem services.
Thank you all. I think that's really important to hear. I may be biased, but I believe this differs a little bit from the way terrestrial restoration works. Of course, it also impacts a larger area, but something special about aquatic ecosystems that we want to capture when we're thinking about how to report the benefits in the areas. So I have a question from the audience for Leonard. The question is the zoning of fishing and protection areas that you presented, is it agreed with the community, or does the community have initial input or participate in the mapping stages? Or is the does the country have its own legislation that creates that zoning? So important about how the community impacts and the legislative frameworks.
Thank you for
Leonard,
that
you're
question.
muted. What can I say
if-
one quick thing? I'm sorry to interrupt you. And I'm going to turn the next question over to Kim, who's co-moderating with me. So just he can choose the next question while you answer. Thank you, Leonard.
Can you hear me? Yes. Quick answer to that. Thank you for that question. We are working with the co-management structures. These are feature for communities. They know these areas from their local knowledge, so we identify collectively with them these areas, and then we even demarcate these areas with them. I didn't show the photo where they're demarcating these areas, so they are part and parcel of mapping these areas, demarcating these areas, and then even monitoring these areas collectively. And then, of course, government agencies also are part and parcel working with us this, especially to help in working with the community to bring in effective enforcement. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pose a question to Bose, but before I do that, I just want to say I loved your word revitalization, Andrea. Excellent. It gets down to the question of these narrow bands that we've been talking about and the connectivity and even how Cynthia mentioned about legislation, putting in directives on kilometer squared and how we're going to measure this. So there's a question here from Ireland. There was a person who had an opportunity to research on the interconnectedness of coastal ecosystems. And he came to the conclusion that restoration on one ecosystem can help the restoration of the other. We've heard quite a lot about those externalities of both impacts, but also the opportunity for linked ecosystems to have synergistic results. So he had two questions, and it was basically about the scale. Should the restoration be done in a large scale, although all the ecosystems are probably not together? And do they need to be restored individually? Because if one ecosystem is recovering quickly, then another can have an effect. And I just wonder, in the kind of project styles we have, Bose, how have you seen people linking different projects together to make sure that the whole is looked at? Thank you.
And it's a fantastic question, Kim. We are getting to that point. So the restoration of the marine habitats is much newer than most of the terrestrial work. We really have, in most of these situations, had 2 or 3 decades at the most to work on this. It's a very different way of looking at systems than traditional ecology, where you're manipulating. So there's been a reason for looking at these important habitats that are the ecosystem engineers that support so much of the diversity and so much of the function. There's a reason for looking at them individually, because it's not until we have the confidence that we can restore one habitat that we can then think about how do we combine the different habitats that really should be making up these nearshore ecosystems that we are wanting to restore. So definitely, and I'm answering the second question first here, it's kind of, are we starting with individual ecosystems deliberately? Yes, but that's because we need to develop the methods, develop the techniques and the experience to be confident that we can actually restore those individual habitats. And then the next part of the question becomes, how do we combine those different habitats? And we're really only just starting that work, and it is important. And there are documented positive feedbacks, so those synergies that you mentioned between different habitat types, and synergies for some, particularly of the fish species. So Cynthia mentioned the nursery function of the seagrass and kelp habitats. The shellfish reef is exactly the same. Most of these habitats are described as the critical coastal habitats because they play such an outsized function in the ecology. And many of the species that benefit from one habitat benefit even more from having the different habitats close enough together to function in a connected framework for the species that we're looking at. So yes, all of those are really important considerations, and we are racing as fast as we possibly can to get to the point where we can actually restore multiple habitats in the kind of mosaic that makes the most sense ecologically. And we're really at the starting line there. So it's an exciting time in marine habitat restoration.
Thank you both. Yeah, I don't really know how we're already at the end of the time, because I could really talk for a long time more about this. So I thank you. And I'm going to ask, we can just let it go over a second. I'm going to ask each speaker one more of these rapid fire, because we've gotten some great questions from the audience. And we will try to put some of these questions together into a document and circulate as much as we can, follow up with the recorded webinar, which will circulate to all registered participants, of which there were over 700, by the way, just so you know. That's a very important topic. So I'm going to ask again, 30 seconds each response, and we'll go in the backwards order this time. So I'll start with Cynthia and we'll end with Bose. And that is, it's known that each ecosystem, of course, has its complexities, but are there guidelines or indicators specifically for aquatic ecosystems and aquatic ecosystem restoration that could work across multiple ecosystems, multiple restoration types? So that came from the audience. It's hard. So sorry. And then we'll hear closing comments after this. Thanks.
Yeah, I think with the metrics that I was sharing, I think the common theme is to recognize that we will need multiple sources of data to inform, that there is no one standard thing that gives us the information that we need and at one scale. And so we need to be thinking creatively about what is the how do we interpret those data consistently, and so that we can roll it up.
Yeah, when we are talking about river restoration of alpine rivers, there is no recipe you can use. You cannot say, do this and every problem is solved. As I described, every river is very specific. Every situation is different. So you have to take a careful look on each river site where you're doing the river restoration. And it is important that you have a group of experts working together on the site and taking the right decisions, and taking into consideration what is happening upstream and what effects are downstream of the rivers.
Yeah, I will say that aquatic systems, as previous speakers have said, is very complex, and there are a lot of aspects that you need to monitor. The major part of it, water is a very key part of it, and therefore indicator that captures issues of quality and quantity of that water will be a unifying indicator, because it manifests itself in biodiversity and other functions that are derived from those aquatic ecosystems. But otherwise, it's a complex ecosystem, and therefore there are many aspects that you need to monitor with various indicators. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, Andreas and Leonard's explanation. The aquatic ecosystems are very complicated to find indicators. I think every project needs people that know very well the ecosystem and try to identify the structural aspect of the ecosystem and how to restore it, depend of the ecosystem service that we expect to recover. Thank you.
And finally, I think it has to link back in some point to the ecosystem service delivery and the scale, the question that you asked previously. I mean, the freshwater systems are intensely important, and intensely important because of their limitation. If we're talking marine and terrestrial, area by itself is a dangerous metric, because what it does is create an incentive for large areas, which tends to push people into those low productivity areas where space is not critical. And the open ocean is important, but in terms of productivity, it is multiple orders of magnitude less productive than some of our coastal habitats. So you can get area gains, but you trade off the incredibly important production that comes from those nearshore critical coastal habitats. And that really needs to be factored in. And I think the most sensible way of doing that is through that delivery of ecosystem services.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazingly fast. I wish we had more time. It's really a fantastic discussion. And I see certain topics keep coming up: scale, temporal variance, multidisciplinary collaboration, the importance of thinking about ecosystem services and how we measure it. So I really hope, and I fully expect, that the conversation is going to continue and we can work together to prioritize and also to appropriately incentivize aquatic restoration on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Bethany Walder for closing remarks. Thank you, Bethany.
Thanks. I will be brief. I know we're over time, but I want to start, and I think the most important thing I want to say is I want to bust a myth here. There is a myth that aquatic restoration is behind terrestrial restoration. It's a myth. They're both young, they're both new, but Bose, you talked about Chesapeake Bay. It's been going on for 25 years. Cynthia, you talked about Puget Sound. In the United States, the biggest restoration that's happening in the United States is Everglades, Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay. It's huge watershed-based restoration. Julian, you talked about not having very many landscape level, large scale restorations. Here in the US, that's where billions and billions of dollars of restoration money are going and have been going for decades and decades, even more so than at the terrestrial level. And I'm speaking from the US perspective, but then Bose, you also talked about this huge investment in Southern Australia, in massive restoration in Southern Australia. So I want to start by busting a myth. I don't think that aquatic is that far behind terrestrial. And I think it's really important to remember that it's not that far behind terrestrial. It doesn't get the coverage, but I think that we're not that far behind on the science, and I think we're definitely not that far behind on the money. And I'm sure there are other huge examples in other parts of the world thinking about big ecosystems, like there's more investment going into the Pantanal in South America, et cetera. In terms of key messages, I want to also just close that there were and Bose, I think you just said a lot of what I wanted to say, but aquatic ecosystems are so critical. They're so important. And there was a big push to get them explicitly mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which happened. And now we're having this conversation about how do we come up with these monitoring tools. So I think that we heard a lot about challenges for monitoring, but we also heard about opportunities and innovative approaches. And I think we saw some really exciting things from Andreas with large-scale use of AI and satellite imagery at the landscape level. We saw some really interesting stuff from Cynthia with dashboarding and creative approaches that are going to help us really clearly visualize for the public how aquatic restoration is happening. And other speakers as well had great examples. And I think that in terms of the challenges, I think the biggest issue, and I think Ashley spoke about it and Bose did, which is this, and the first rapid fire question, which is this issue of really measuring not just the site that is impacted, but the site that is restored, but the actual scale of the impact. And that's a big issue that is much more significant at the aquatic level than at the terrestrial level. But it relates to the fact that these systems are totally connected. And we heard a lot of discussion about that as well. And I want to close just reiterating what Bose said, because it came up in, I think, 4 different presentations, that there are issues with regional versus rolled up data. And so, Bose, you talked about the potential for choosing where we do restoration because we have this incentive to just have area. So measuring just area becomes an issue. But it's also, as Cynthia showed, if you measure just area and you don't break that out and parse it and disaggregate it, you might get a really nice number, but you might have really significantly impacted places within that. And so I think, and then even looking at some of the presentation from Leonard, where you're looking at these different places and how you're, and from Carlos. So you see this across all of the different components. So I think that we have a lot of information. If there's anything that I heard today is we have a lot of knowledge, a lot of information. There's extraordinary work going on in aquatic ecosystems, and aquatic ecosystems are vital for human life. So we've got to figure out how to restore them. and the services they provide. And you all are leading the way. And we have so many more people on this call who are also probably doing this work in your backyards, in your home countries. And we have so much to learn from each other. So Ashley, congratulations, and Kim for pulling this group together. And I can't wait to see what comes of it. And so that as we continue to do this work with the Global Biodiversity Framework, we see how we can take these lessons learned and share them and really show the world how much incredible work is going on in aquatic ecosystems, and that they are not the ugly stepchild to terrestrial ecosystems, and they are actually one of the most, they represent some of the most beautiful places on Earth. So thank you all for your amazing work, and I look forward to seeing where it goes.
Thank you so much, Bethany. That was a great way to wrap it all up. So many essential ideas, and a passion for aquatic ecosystems. Bust a myth, I think, will be something we all remember. I really appreciate it. So before I close, I do want to thank Chloe Pagliaro for all her help in preparing this webinar and for her work behind the scenes to make it this success today. Thank you very much, Chloe. We will be circulating the recording of this webinar to all registered participants, so please keep in touch. Thank you very much.